The fifth plenary meeting of the 32nd special session of the General Assembly is called to order. The Assembly will resume its consideration of Agenda Item 7, entitled the General Debate. Before we begin the list of speakers, I would like to remind members of important organizational matters pertaining to the conduct of the General Debate. As members are aware, the General Assembly, in its decision 75/562, decided that member states and regional economic integration organizations, parties to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and observers to the General Assembly, in line with paragraph 2C of its resolution 74/276, may submit a pre-recorded statement by their head of state or government, head of delegation or other dignitary, which will be played in the General Assembly Hall during the special session, after introduction by their representative who is physically present in the Assembly Hall. In this regard, I would like to address important organizational matters pertaining to the conduct of the plenary meeting. Introduction of the pre-recorded statements will be made by the representatives from their national seats. Due to time constraints, it is expected that the introductory remarks will be kept concise. Statements delivered by the representatives who are physically present in the Assembly Hall can be made from the national seats or the rostrum. As set out in the resolution 74/276, statements in the general debate will be limited to 5 minutes for individual delegations. In the case of pre-recorded statements, introductory remarks and length of the video itself shall be counted in the allocated time limit. In accordance with decision 75/562, in addition to the verbatim records of the special session, the President of the General Assembly will circulate as a document of the Assembly a compilation document of the statements delivered by means of pre-recorded statements during the special session and submitted to the President no later than the day on which the pre-recorded statement is played in the Assembly Hall, and that such pre-recorded statements will be attached to the verbatim records of the special session. Submissions in this regard should be made to e-statements@un.org. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey. Oh, they're here? Oh, okay. Okay, they're here. My apologies, Turkey. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Maldives to introduce a statement by the Minister.
I have the honor to introduce His Excellency Mr. Ibrahim Amir, Minister of Finance of Republic of Maldives.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, small island developing states face immense challenges, including that of corruption, tearing into the economic, social, and political fabric of society. While we have made immense strides in our development and attained the status of an upper middle income country and reduced poverty levels greatly, we are experiencing a widening income disparity, which has been partly attributed to corruption through its effects on income distribution, utilization of aid funds, and influence in public expenditure. To combat corruption at national level, His Excellency President Ibrahim Muhammad Solih launched the Zero Tolerance to Corruption campaign, under which numerous measures were taken to increase transparency and to amend laws and regulations that facilitated corruption and exploitation of state resources. A Presidential Commission on Corruption and State Asset Recovery has been formed to recover state assets and to ensure that all legal duties in investigating corruption and abuse of power within state and government institutions are carried out. In addition, a whistleblower portal has also been established to facilitate anonymous submission of complaints and documents and to communicate with the Anti-Corruption Commission. To foster a culture of good governance and eliminate corruption within the state-owned enterprises due to its high vulnerability, especially with regard to procurement, where usually the value of contracts is very large, a number of actions were taken and enforced. We faced many challenges within this reform process, but we have successfully introduced a corporate governance code for state-owned enterprises with strong internal control mechanisms and introduced a comprehensive procurement guideline for SOEs, which is principle-based and ensures a transparent and competitive bidding process. We now have redressal mechanisms for post-procurement issues, which assists in settling grievances in a shorter time frame compared to litigation. Many other efforts and measures have been taken to promote good governance and strengthen our institutions. There is only so much that policies and campaigns can do. We strongly believe in increasing transparency to combat corruption. To lead by example, financial statements of all politically appointed and elected public officials are disclosed to the public. Additionally, the publication of fiscal, debt, and economic data is carried out, including weekly COVID-19 related spending reports. This has increased transparency and accountability in a time where most of our resources and financing have been geared towards the health and economic response related to this pandemic. Just this week, we have published our first fiscal risk statement, a testament of our commitment to fiscal transparency and improved fiscal management. We continue to work with our development partners and international institutions to identify and close the loopholes by reviewing our public financial regulation and assessing the fiscal risks in a holistic manner. Maldives is party to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, and we will remain steadfast in our efforts to implement the convention and learn from different state parties through the implementation review mechanism. Strengthening the legal framework has been and continues to be a key aspect of the government's concerted effort to tackle corruption. A whistleblower protection law has been adopted and an amendment to the penal code has been enacted this year to criminalize illicit enrichment, which marks the achievement of a significant milestone. This amendment to the penal code has been complemented by the broadening the definition of corruption in the Anti-Corruption Commission Act. Our continued efforts and reforms have yielded concrete results. In 2020, Maldives improved to 75th rank from the 135th rank in the Corruption Perception Index, and we are steadfast in our commitment to keep improving. I thank you.
I wish to thank the Minister of Finance of Maldives for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Mr. President, Excellencies, we would like to thank the President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkır, for convening this special session of the General Assembly on challenges and measures to prevent and combat corruption and strengthen international cooperation. As we are all aware, corruption poses a fundamental challenge to our societies, undermines the sense of justice, and harms belief in equity and fairness. It generates unjust gains and unfair advantages for its perpetrators and frustrates those who abide by the rules. Additionally, corrupt practices hinder trade, economic growth, and socio-economic development. They constitute a threat that transcends national boundaries. Clearly, there is no way to tackle this challenge without robust international cooperation. In this connection, Turkey deems UN Convention Against Corruption, UNGAS, a highly valuable legal instrument to address this multidimensional and multinational problem. In our view, UNGAS constitutes a solid manifestation of the determination and will of the international community to prevent and eradicate the corrupt practices from all segments of life. Mr. President, implementation review mechanism set up under the Convention is a dynamic component which enables states parties to strengthen their national legislation and practices against corruption. Turkey's review process for the second cycle is currently underway. We will continue to support the review mechanism and will actively participate in the coming cycles. In our view, each state party to the Convention needs to implement effective anti-corruption policies with wide participation from the society. Establishing anti-corruption bodies, defining a clear code of conduct for the public officers are also of critical importance in terms of effective implementation of the Convention. Facilitating the exchange of information and good practices among states parties, as well as the technical assistance delivery for the requesting member states are the essential means for furthering anti-corruption efforts. Finally, asset recovery emerges as another major field in fight against corruption. Clearly and importantly, the international community needs to take further action to secure the return of proceeds of corruption and stolen assets to the country of origin. Mr. President, in line with UNGAS, Turkey enhanced its capacity to counter corruption through numerous legislative and administrative steps. In this context, Turkey either adopted new laws or modified the existing ones that include, amongst the others, the Law on Ethics Commission for Public Officials, the Law on Public Procurement, and the Law Against Laundering Proceeds of Crime. The Turkish Criminal Code was also reformed accordingly. We believe that transparency, accountability, and inclusivity constitute the key components of any response designed to fight corruption. In this respect, Turkish national strategy against corruption is carried out with involvement and in close partnership with the civil society, business sector, and academia. Mr. President, before I conclude, let me highlight Turkey's conviction that our collective success in fight against corruption will play a decisive role in consolidating good governance and sustainable economic growth for the future generations. Turkey is committed to continue to take action in eradicating corruption and supporting international efforts towards this end. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nepal.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I thank you, Mr. President, for convening this special session of the General Assembly against corruption. When the COVID-19 pandemic requires governments to spend from the public coffer in a greater speed and scale, combating corruption with checks and balances can mean the difference between life and death. Corruption creates a cascade of worsening outcomes. It weakens the performance of public institutions, undermines people's trust on government, germinates crimes and terrorism in societies, and crumbles the notion of democracy and rule of law. And as a result, governments may lose their legitimacy in the eyes of the public. It hinders economic development and further imperils the achievement of sustainable development goals. While corruption is both national and international phenomenon, it has a disproportionate impact on poor and most vulnerable people by increasing the cost and reducing the access to public services, including education, health, and justice. In this context, full and effective implementation of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption is critical to achieving just, inclusive, and prosperous societies as envisaged in 2030 agenda. Mr. President, guided by the long-term national aspiration, prosperous Nepal, happy Nepali, the government of Nepal has adopted zero-tolerance approach against corruption, strengthened necessary institutional and legal framework for open, transparent, and accountable governance system. As a constitutional body, the Commission for Investigation of Abuse of Authority is an ombudsman to investigate, criminalize the corruption cases in the public sector. The government is committed to strengthening the Commission and other various anti-corruption agencies to ensure integrity, transparency, and accountability. A state party to the UNGASS since 2011, Nepal has been making its effort to implement the convention and fight against corruption through a national strategy and action plan. We believe that mechanism for review of implementation of convention is instrumental in strengthening our anti-corruption efforts. We appreciate the recommendations made during Nepal's first review cycle and remain committed to expanding the scope of integrity rules and strengthening capacity of our anti-corruption institutions. We continue to promote an informed society with free access to information, which is a strong deterrent to corruption. We collaborate with free media, civil society, and the public to create corruption-free society. Our initiatives on bringing transparency on the cost, time, and procedure of public service, including through Citizens' Charter and e-governance, have improved significantly the performance of our public institutions. Over the last few years, Nepal has made significant improvements in various governance indicators, including Human Development Index, Peace Index, Rule of Law, Corruption Control, and Transparency and Happiness Index. We remain committed to building on this progress and materializing Nepal's peace dreams of peace, stability, prosperity, and happiness. Towards this end, our efforts to prevent and control corruption will only continue to gather more strength. Mr. President, as we double down to rebuild our economy better than ever from pandemic-induced economic downturn, it will be important for us all to ensure the highest standard of integrity to build a clean, transparent, and accountable government. No country can effectively prevent and combat corruption alone. Strong multilateral cooperation is essential to fight corruption in this interconnected world. And there is a need of high-level cooperation among member states for information sharing and capacity building. To conclude, Mr. President, achievement of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is contingent upon a corruption-free society and good governance. The government of Nepal is committed to strengthening necessary institutional and legal framework to ensure transparent and accountable government that will ensure accelerated development and prosperity for all Nepali people. And anti-corruption should be our common language, and prevention and eradication of corruption our common pursuit. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nepal. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Mr. President, my delegation welcomes the declaration of the adoption of political declaration of the special session of the General Assembly on challenges, measures to prevent and combat corruption, and strengthen international cooperation, which will serve as an important foundation for member states and other relevant stakeholders in the fight against corruption. The pervasive problem of corruption worldwide continues to threaten political stability and public security, while undermining economic development and poverty eradication, as well as the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. The convening of this GS special session proves that the international community has further attached great importance to the issue and marked this historic milestone in encouraging countries, international and regional organizations to continue strengthening their efforts and cooperation in tackling corruption, which is an integral part for attaining the SDGs. Mr. President, for its part, the Lao PDI has always been determined in its fight against corruption, and it has been committed to upholding its rights, obligations, as stated in the international conventions, particularly the United Nations Conventions Against Corruption, as well as in achieving the SDG number 16. The Lao PDI has clearly set out its inspiration and inspection and anti-corruption policy in each period, develop comprehensive strategies to prevent and combat corruption, develop and revise law on the state inspection, law on anti-corruption, law on the handling of petitions, penal code, civil code, decree on asset declaration, legislations related to the promotion of participation of mass organizations, media agencies, and the general public in the work of the inspection and anti-corruption. The National Assembly's rules of procedure for a vote of no confidence against individuals establish state inspection and anti-corruption agencies at all levels. Most recently, the Government Inspection Authority, preceded by the previously under the government's oversight, has now been replaced by the State Inspection Authority, which is now under the direct supervision of the President as head of state, in order to raise its status, mandate, rights, and functions, as well as its independence. The Lao PDI has also deployed all its efforts on preventing and combating corruption in a number of ways, including increased public awareness, developing anti-corruption related teaching curricula at all levels, reducing bureaucracies and service bottlenecks, utilizing advanced technology in public administration and financial sector, enhancing regular and early inspections, as well as inspections based on order, complaints, requests, and audit findings, establishing a coordination mechanism among concerned authorities, and conducting investigations in accordance with the relevant laws and regulations. Over the past years, the authorities have been able to strictly inspect, investigate, prosecute, sentence, and discipline offenders in accordance with laws, and a number of stolen assets have been recovered. The Lao PDI has also enhanced cooperation and exchanged best practices with other countries, regional and international organizations, including UNODC, successfully participated in both review cycles and just completed reviewing Burkina Faso, and is currently preparing to jointly conduct a review of Niue in the second review cycle. As a member of ASEAN Parties Against Corruption, the Lao PDI has actively engaged in other bilateral and trilateral cooperations with 5 neighboring countries based on the Memorandum of Understanding, as well as with other friendly countries and international organizations. The Lao PDI remains firmly supportive of international cooperation in preventing and combating corruption under the framework of United Nations Convention Against Corruption, in accordance with the principle of respect for national sovereignty, non-interference into domestic affairs, and equality and mutual benefits. We also support and encourage the participation of all sectors in combating corruption in line with the constitutions, laws, procedures, and circumstances of each country. In our view, it is our view that the effective cooperation under the UN Convention Against Corruption or relevant mechanisms, developed countries and international organizations should further enhance their support and assistance to developing countries in order to help increase their capacity to prevent and combat corruption. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lao People's Democratic Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Excelencias, delegados, delegadas. Chile saluda la convocatoria a la sesión especial de la Asamblea General para combatir la corrupción, evento que consideramos necesario y oportuno, no solo para reafirmar el compromiso de Chile con la Convención de las Naciones Unidas contra la Corrupción, UNCAC, en sus 15 años de existencia, sino también para renovar los esfuerzos colectivos para combatir este fenómeno en concordancia con los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible 16 y 17. El combate a la corrupción es un eje central de nuestra política exterior, razón por la cual trabajamos activamente en todos los foros multilaterales para impulsar la implementación de los principales instrumentos internacionales dedicados a esta lucha, que incluye a la UNCAC, pero también a la Convención Interamericana contra la Corrupción de la Organización de Estados Americanos y la Convención de la OCDE para combatir el cohecho a funcionarios públicos extranjeros. En relación con la UNCAC, Chile es uno de los países evaluadores de España en la revisión de la implementación de sus capítulos 2 y 5. Asimismo, nuestro país está siendo evaluado por Jamaica y Uzbekistán en un proceso que, si bien ha sido postergado por la crisis sanitaria mundial, esperamos concluir durante el presente año. Chile asume estas tareas con responsabilidad y compromiso, puesto que las recomendaciones y evaluaciones que emanan de estos procesos nos han permitido llevar adelante una serie de modificaciones legislativas para actualizar y fortalecer nuestra institucionalidad anticorrupción y con ello mejorar también nuestros niveles de transparencia, integridad y rendición de cuentas. En este marco me permito destacar dos importantes avances legislativos: la Ley 21.211 sobre información y rendición de cuentas de gastos reservados y la Ley 21.121 que modifica el Código Penal chileno y otras normas legales para la prevención, detección y persecución de la corrupción. Nuestro sistema anticorrupción, integrado por múltiples instituciones, nos ha permitido minimizar, detectar y castigar la corrupción cuando se produce, así como combatir con eficacia todo tipo de abusos y proteger la dignidad de la ciudadanía. Esto se ha visto reflejado en los indicadores internacionales sobre transparencia, los que sitúan a Chile en lugares de avanzada en nuestra región. Sin embargo, reconocemos que existe aún mucho por mejorar y por ello debemos hacer transversal esta lucha contra la corrupción. Señor presidente, Chile quisiera felicitar a Perú y Emiratos Árabes Unidos por haber facilitado el proceso de negociación de la declaración política en forma inclusiva y transparente, que culminó en mayo pasado con su aprobación por la Conferencia de los Estados Partes y ha sido formalmente adoptada en esta sesión. Esta declaración política quedaron plasmados elementos que Chile considera primordiales en los esfuerzos de la comunidad internacional para combatir la corrupción, como la relevancia e independencia de las entidades fiscalizadoras superiores, el rol de la sociedad civil y la importancia de contar con una perspectiva de género. Sobre las primeras, la Contraloría General de la República de Chile realiza acciones concretas para combatir el flagelo de la corrupción. tales como su formulación de una estrategia nacional anticorrupción y el liderazgo que ejerce junto al Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo y la Alianza Anticorrupción UNCAC, una instancia público-privado que reúne a 30 instituciones con el propósito justamente de promover y fortalecer la integridad en nuestro país bajo los estándares de la UNCAC. En particular, destacamos que la declaración une a esta Asamblea General con la comunidad internacional en un compromiso común y, tal como lo dice su título, nos ofrece una hoja de ruta para abordar conjuntamente los múltiples desafíos asociados a la lucha contra la corrupción. A estos desafíos debemos sumar aquellos derivados de la actual pandemia y sus devastadoras consecuencias económicas y sociales. Sabemos que la corrupción prospera en tiempos de crisis debido a entornos alimentados por el desorden y la confusión. Por lo tanto, Chile reconoce la importancia de incorporar estrategias anticorrupción en las respuestas a la crisis para garantizar una recuperación inclusiva, lo que solo puede lograrse con integridad y responsabilidad. Para concluir, señor presidente, permítame señalar que en momentos como estos, la corrupción no solamente cuesta recursos públicos, sino también vidas, por lo que resulta especial abordar este fenómeno desde una mirada colectiva en el marco de la cooperación internacional y la asistencia técnica. Señor presidente, reiteramos el compromiso de Chile con los esfuerzos multilaterales para combatir la corrupción y con la Convención de Naciones Unidas contra la Corrupción y deseamos el pleno éxito de esta sesión especial. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
I thank the distinguished representative of Chile. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished delegates, William Shakespeare, in his play Measure for Measure, a play set in Vienna where vice at that time ran rampant and the laws had been allowed to sleep for many years, when law enforcement was in the hands of a trusted minister, with instructions to enforce discipline as he thought fit. This play highlighted the innate immorality and corruption in the heart of man. He was quoted to say, quote, "I have seen corruption boil and bubble till it o'erran the stew." That's what Shakespeare said then. Corruption, distinguished delegates, predates Shakespeare. It's a global phenomenon and a scourge on our societies and plagues every country. No one may say that they are immune from corruption. It dates to when a society organized for the first time creating public institutions. It is a global menace that bears heavy costs on money and lives. It is multifaceted and its roots go deep and are entrenched. It is not a problem faced by one part of the world or the developing or the developed world, rich or poor, north or south. Its effects may be magnified in poorer nations, of course, that are more vulnerable. But corruption, like COVID-19, the virus, knows no borders and is everywhere. In the private sector, the scales are enormous in comparison. Some global multinational corporations have spent billions of dollars in corporate schemes and payoffs that have to come to light with scales that dwarf, I say dwarf, the GDPs of many small countries. The Secretary General of the United Nations has aptly stated that corruption obliterates people's faith in good governance and seriously damages the relationship between the state and its people. It must be noted that it is the very public that complains of corruption, that resorts to corruption, that resorts to corrupt practices to achieve unlawful advantage through the offer of illegal gratifications. Distinguished delegates, forget not the reality that so long as there are givers, there will be willing takers. That's the reality of it. These givers or offerers, as I mentioned before, come from the so-called civil society and the corporate entities who believe that everything and every person is a purchasable commodity. Make no mistake, I can assure you that these criminals are not one step, but 3 steps ahead of us. Their networks are well organized, with their tentacles well into the very fabric of our societies. We therefore need to meaningfully address this issue and take the fight beyond just rhetoric. The World Economic Forum has estimated that the cost of corruption is at least 2.6 trillion, or 5% of global domestic product. The World Bank has estimated that business and individuals pay more than $1 trillion in bribes each year. There are other estimates that corruption, bribery, theft, and tax evasion and other illicit financial flows cost developing countries approximately $1.26 trillion per year. So in today's world, distinguished delegates, as we all combat and seek to recover from a global pandemic, this loss of vital and much needed resources that is needed for our economic progress and sustainable development is grave. International cooperation and collaboration is the only way to defeat this scourge. We need to unite. The Convention Against Corruption is one of the main tools in advancing our collective fight. Sustainable Development Goal 16 deals explicitly with corruption, and its target presents a template for action. Though through the Convention's peer review mechanism, countries have worked together, as we heard just a while ago, to build a foundation of trust and accountability. There is a need to educate and empower our citizens, promote transparency, and strengthen international cooperation to recover stolen assets. The battle against corruption is vital for the success of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This is not solely a task for governments. While governments need to legislate, implement, and enforce laws, it also needs to enlist the media, the private sector, civil society, and academia in this battle. And the 2003 UN Convention is the bedrock, I say, of our international and global anti-corruption efforts, being the only legally binding universal anti-corruption instrument. Distinguished delegates, its far-reaching approach and the mandatory character of many of its provisions makes it, I say, the ideal tool for developing a comprehensive response to the global problem of corruption. The fact that the Convention now has a near global acceptance with 187 states is a testament of both the magnitude of the problem and, moreover, that it is a fundamental recognition that corruption is neither an acceptable cost of doing business nor a necessary evil, but simply an unacceptable crime, and many states are taking decisive action against high-level corruption. Distinguished delegates, the Convention provides a common basis, I say, to take the necessary steps to prevent and combat corruption. If we all spend enough political will, I say, and use the treaty effectively, and states can seek to prevent, criminalize, investigate, or prosecute corruption, or recover the return of stolen assets, are a series of measures and actions that can be taken. Anti-corruption, my dear friends, anti-corruption technical assistance and capacity building is an area that must be strengthened between states as an urgent priority. Mr. President, Sri Lanka, as a state party to the convention, remains committed to fight against corruption. And we stand ready to work with states and the United Nations to achieve the objective of the UN Convention Against Corruption for practical and meaningful collaboration and cooperation to effectively combat corruption. We in Sri Lanka have put in place enabling legislation that seeks to give effect to the convention with the Independent Commission to investigate allegations of bribery or corruption. Sri Lanka has submitted the comprehensive self-assessment checklist to the Secretariat of the Convention. The role of effective policies and practices in preventing corruption cannot be overemphasized. Delegates, while the Convention provides for state parties to afford one another the widest measure, I say, of technical assistance, particularly for developing countries and their efforts towards its implementation, sufficient and stable funding to UNODC needs to be assured. Repatriation of public assets is an international obligation under the Convention, and accordingly, elimination of safe havens for stolen assets and overcoming the bureaucratic procedures and legal barriers should remain a key priority in our legal fight against corruption. Mutual legal assistance and cooperation amongst law enforcement services is an essential, and such cooperative measures would harness efforts towards the suppression of criminal networks and such cooperative measures towards the dealing with criminal networks of corrupt officials in countries of origin and criminal networks of financial experts in the countries of destination, who are working hand in hand in virtually in the same glove, benefiting from illegal transfers of funds. Mr. President, turning to Sri Lanka, we have established the Commission, as I said, to investigate allegations of bribery or corruption in 1994, which is primarily mandated to prevent, investigate, and prosecute cases concerning bribery and corruption. Sri Lanka signed the convention on the 15th of March 2004, and demonstrating its vital importance, ratified it a few weeks later in that same month, and the convention entered into force on the 14th of December 2005. Our country has enabled the convention to work in its full measure. The Bribery Act and the Declaration of Assets and Liabilities Law assign powers to operate, investigate, and engage in litigation and such procedures to bring to book those offenders. The scope of the Commission's powers have been expanded, strengthened through recent amendments to the Bribery Act. Mr. President, the Commission has achieved accomplishment in eradicating bribery and corruption to a large measure. Sri Lanka is presently in the process of drafting an act on the proceeds of crime. The new law will have provision on NCB asset recovery, management, etc. The act is envisaged to strengthen the current regime on criminal property recovery and foreign mutual assistance that would be rendered. The present draft is now being finalized with comments from a wide range of stakeholders, including the Commission, the FIU, and the law enforcement authorities. Mr. President, Sri Lanka has always followed on its international obligations under the Convention. Our successful completion of the first two cycles of UNCAC review mechanisms bears testimony for the country's strong commitment towards the elimination of corruption. Sri Lanka's self-assessment checklist, as I said before, on the criminalization and law enforcement and internal cooperation and preventive measures and asset recovery have been reviewed by state parties to the convention in 2013 and 2017, respectively. We strongly believe that the existing international anti-corruption architecture provides an effective and robust framework for the prevention and the combating of corruption. We remain convinced that this special session has provided an invaluable opportunity to galvanize, if I was to use that expression, our collective political approach from governments and the larger international community to take stock of our efforts and commitments and identify solutions to the common issues before us that prevent our work in preventing and combating corruption, and share best practices and the lessons learned. The range of diverse stakeholders that have taken part in these sessions for the last few days shows that we have the collective commitment to work together. Distinguished delegates, finally, Sri Lanka reiterates our firm commitment to prevent and counter corruption in all its forms and manifestations, in strict compliance with the Convention and its review mechanisms. And we strongly believe that international cooperation and asset recovery remain the key elements of our collective endeavor to eliminate this global scourge. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Haiti.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, de me donner la parole. Monsieur le Président, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, j'ai l'insigne honneur de prendre la parole au nom de la délégation haïtienne dans le cadre de cette 5e séance plénière de la session spéciale de l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies sur les défis et les mesures pour prévenir et lutter contre la corruption et renforcer la coopération internationale. J'en profite pour vous adresser les félicitations de ma délégation pour l'organisation de cette importante session en dépit des contraintes liées à la pandémie de la COVID-19. Monsieur le Président, ma délégation s'est réjouie des efforts déjà déployés par notre organisation dans la lutte contre cette pratique redoutable. À cet effet, la Convention des Nations unies contre la corruption constitue un accomplissement sans précédent, un cadre global de lutte contre ce phénomène qui est devenu, et je dirais, omniprésent. Les règles énoncées à travers les 71 articles de la Convention couvrent 5 grands domaines clés, à savoir la prévention, l'incrimination, la coopération internationale, l'assistance technique et échange d'informations, ainsi que le recouvrement d'avoirs volés. Ce dernier point constitue un principe fondamental, une originalité de la Convention en raison du fait qu'il représente un cadre juridique important qui permet de geler, de confisquer et de restituer des fonds acquis par le biais de la corruption. Monsieur le Président, la corruption, cet ennemi commun de l'humanité, est loin d'être un phénomène nouveau. Le philosophe et polymathe grec de l'Antiquité, Aristote, en parlait déjà dans son traité intitulé « De la génération et de la corruption ». Cette notion philosophique et politique est devenue aujourd'hui un fléau mondial qui n'épargne aucune société, notamment les pays en développement, qui apparaissent les plus vulnérables et les plus exposés aux conséquences néfastes de ces mâles endémiques. Il ne fait aucun doute que la corruption représente une grave menace pour la stabilité et la sécurité de nos sociétés. Elle constitue donc un obstacle pour la stabilité et la sécurité de nos sociétés. Elle constitue un obstacle à la réalisation des objectifs de développement durable à l'horizon de 2030 à la démocratie, à la sécurité et à l'état de droit. C'est d'ailleurs ce qu'ont démontré certaines études réalisées sur la corruption. Monsieur le Président, en Haïti, la corruption fait partie du patrimoine colonial que les planteurs de Saint-Domingue nous ont laissé en héritage. C'est donc ce modèle impérialiste d'enrichissement illicite au détriment de l'économie nationale qui se maintient jusqu'à aujourd'hui en dépit du fait que la lutte contre la corruption a été initiée en Haïti il y a plus de 185 ans. En effet, les questions relatives à la responsabilité des fonctionnaires et des employés des finances, à la corruption et au détournement commis par les fonctionnaires publics ont été introduites dans la législation haïtienne depuis 1834. Il existe en Haïti tout un éventail de dispositions légales et institutionnelles sur la lutte contre la corruption et les infractions assimilées. Nous pouvons citer à titre d'exemple les articles 238 et 243 de la Constitution haïtienne de 1987, les articles 137 et 144 du Code pénal haïtien auxquels s'ajoutent la Convention interaméricaine et la Convention des Nations unies contre la corruption, ratifiées respectivement par Haïti en juin 2004 et en juin 2007. D'autres textes légaux, comme la loi du 9 mai 2014 portant prévention et répression de la corruption en Haïti, fixent les règles irrélatives. Monsieur le Président, la Convention des Nations unies fait obligation aux États parties d'adopter des politiques anticorruption et de mettre en place des institutions chargées de la mise en œuvre de telles politiques. À cet effet, nous avons procédé à la création de tout un ensemble d'institutions nationales de lutte contre la corruption. Il s'agit notamment de la Cour supérieure des comptes et du contentieux administratif, de l'unité centrale de renseignement financier, de la Commission nationale des marchés publics, de l'unité de lutte contre la corruption et de l'inspection générale des finances. Toutes ces institutions ainsi que le Parlement haïtien ont en commun la lutte contre la corruption. Monsieur le Président, Haïti subit de plein fouet les effets pervers de la corruption, notamment l'insécurité, la criminalité et le détournement des maigres ressources dont dispose le pays. C'est pourquoi, depuis son arrivée au pouvoir, le président de la République d'Haïti, son Excellence M. Jovenel Moïse, s'est engagé dans une lutte sans merci contre le phénomène de la corruption. Il s'est attaqué à ce phénomène dans ses racines en mettant en place toute une stratégie nationale de lutte contre la corruption, conformément à l'article 5 de la Convention des Nations unies. Les actions du gouvernement haïtien sont orientées dans le sens du renforcement de la lutte contre la corruption à travers des institutions à caractère répressif, de contrôle et celles qui interviennent dans la chaîne de vérification des dépenses publiques. Monsieur le Président, notre présence ici témoigne de la volonté politique des gouvernements et de la communauté internationale dans son ensemble de parvenir à des solutions communes dans la lutte contre la corruption. Cette session extraordinaire nous donne l'occasion de faire le point sur nos efforts et nos engagements respectifs dans la lutte contre la corruption et d'identifier des solutions collectives aux défis communs de la prévention et de la lutte contre ce fléau mondial. En conclusion, cette série de débats nous donne l'opportunité de partager nos meilleures pratiques et les leçons apprises dans le but de mieux conjuguer nos efforts dans la mise en œuvre de la Convention. Ma délégation renouvelle l'engagement de la République d'Haïti de continuer de faire de la lutte contre la corruption l'une de ses principales priorités pour sortir le pays du sous-développement et de continuer de supporter les Nations unies dans toutes les initiatives visant à combattre ce fléau. Monsieur le Président, distingués invités, distingués délégués, je vous remercie de votre attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Haiti. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيد الرئيس، في البداية أود أن أتقدم بالشكر الجزيل لسعادة فولكان بوسكير رئيس الجمعية العامة على عقد هذه الدورة الاستثنائية الهامة للجمعية العامة لمناقشة التحديات والتدابير الرامية إلى منع الفساد ومكافحته، وذلك تنفيذا لقرار الجمعية العامة 191/73 الصادر بتاريخ 17 من شهر ديسمبر 2018. كما أتقدم بالشكر الجزيل لكل من ممثلي دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة وجمهورية بيرو على تيسيرهم المفاوضات التي توصلت إلى توافق آراء حول الإعلان السياسي الذي تم اعتماده في اليوم الأول من أعمال هذه الدورة. السيد الرئيس، تعد اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة لمكافحة الفساد والتي مر على دخولها حيز النفاذ ما يقارب العقدين من الزمان حجر الأساس لمكافحة الفساد، وأنه على الرغم من النجاحات التي حققتها تنفيذ الدول الأطراف لبنود الاتفاقية على كافة المستويات، إلا أن الغايات والأهداف المرجوة منها لم تتحقق بالكامل، لأن هذه الظاهرة لا تزال متفشية في كثير من المجتمعات، وأصبحت ونتيجة للتقدم التكنولوجي أكثر تعقيداً وتأثيراً على اقتصاديات الدول. فالفساد لا يزال موجوداً، والعالم لا يزال متأثراً بتداعيات هذه الآفة المرتبطة ارتباطاً وثيقاً بالكثير من الجرائم الخطيرة العابرة للحدود، منها على سبيل المثال لا الحصر تمويل الإرهاب، غسل الأموال، الاتجار بالأسلحة، وتهريب المخدرات، وغيرها من الجرائم الخطيرة. لذلك لا بد من تجديد الالتزام وبذل المزيد من الجهود لمعالجة الثغرات المتبقية والصعوبات القائمة والمستجدة التي تواجه تنفيذ الاتفاقية. فالفساد أصبح ظاهرة عالمية تقوض سيادة القانون وتهدد الاستقرار السياسي والاقتصادي والاجتماعي للدول، كما تستنزف موارد الدولة وتعتبر عائقاً أمام العديد من الدول، وعلى رأسها الدول النامية، لتحقيق أهداف التنمية المستدامة 2030. ورغم التدابير والوسائل التي تتبناها الدول وتتخذها للوقاية من هذه الآفة العالمية المستشرية، إلا أن الدول سواء غنية أو فقيرة، صغيرة أو كبيرة، تعاني من هذه الظاهرة، ولا توجد دولة محصنة منها، فتأثيرها السلبي على الاقتصاد الوطني والعالمي قد تجاوز 2 تريليون دولار سنوياً. ونضم صوتنا هنا لكافة الدول الأعضاء بالترحيب بالإعلان السياسي الذي تم اعتماده، والذي يعد بمثابة وسيلة جديدة ينتهجها المجتمع الدولي لمواصلة مكافحة الآثار المدمرة لهذه الآفة والحد من مخاطرها، وهو ما يتطلب مزيدا من التعاون والشراكات بين الدول الأعضاء وتبادل المعلومات والخبرات وتنفيذ أفضل الممارسات، وتحسين وبناء قدرات المؤسسات العامة في الدولة في إطار تعزيز الحكم الرشيد والحد من البيروقراطية واتباع أفضل السبل لتعزيز المساءلة والمحاسبة وعدم إفلات مرتكبي جرائم الفساد من العقاب. السيد الرئيس، في إطار الجهود الوطنية التي تقوم بها الكويت للحد من هذه الآفة الخطيرة، فقد قامت بسن العديد من القوانين والتشريعات لضمان سيادة القانون ومكافحة الجرائم وتحقيق مستويات عالية من العدالة الجنائية. فأصدرت في يناير من العام 2019 الاستراتيجية الوطنية الشاملة لتعزيز النزاهة ومكافحة الفساد، والتي تسعى لتنفيذها مع برنامج الأمم المتحدة الإنمائي ومكتب الأمم المتحدة للجريمة والمخدرات في فيينا. كما سبقها إنشاء الهيئة العامة لمكافحة الفساد نزاهة بموجب القانون رقم 2 لعام 2016، والتي جاء إنشاؤها استجابة لمتطلبات تنفيذ المادتين الخامسة والسادسة من اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة لمكافحة الفساد، ولتوفير بيئة آمنة للهيئة لتمكينها من كشف الفساد والإبلاغ عنه ومكافحته. كما أن المادة 4 من قانون إنشاء الهيئة أكد على أهداف أساسية تسعى الهيئة لتحقيقها، وهي تنفيذ اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة لمكافحة الفساد وتعزيز مبدأ التعاون والمشاركة مع الدول والمنظمات الإقليمية والدولية، بالإضافة إلى تشجيع دور مؤسسات ومنظمات المجتمع المدني في مكافحة الفساد وتوعية الأفراد بمخاطره وتوسيع نطاق المعرفة بوسائله وأساليب الوقاية منه، وكل ما من شأنه مساعدة الدولة لتجنب العوائق أو العقبات التي قد تعترض مسيرتها التنموية الرامية لتحقيق أهداف الأمم المتحدة التنموية. وفي الختام نجدد التزامنا بالاتفاقية الدولية لمكافحة الفساد وآليات المراجعة، والتأكيد على أهمية مكافحة هذه الجريمة الخطيرة والآفة المتغلغلة في المجتمعات والمنافية لكافة القيم الأخلاقية، مؤكدين بأن التعاون والعمل الجماعي واعتماد أطر شاملة ومتوازنة يعتبر السبيل الأمثل لمواجهة مخاطرها المتزايدة، رغبة في حماية المجتمعات وبناء الثقة بين الأفراد والحكومات، خاصة بعد تداعيات جائحة كوفيد-19 التي لا تزال كثير من الدول تعاني من آثارها السلبية على مختلف مناحي الحياة الصحية والاجتماعية والاقتصادية. وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kuwait. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Libya.
على تنظيم الدورة الاستثنائية 32 للجمعية العامة، ونحن على ثقة من أن جهودكم ستسهم في نجاح عملها. سيد الرئيس، السيدات والسادة، يرحب وفد بلادي بعقد هذه الدورة الاستثنائية التي تم خلالها اعتماد الإعلان السياسي المعنون التزامنا المشترك بالعمل بفاعلية على التصدي للتحديات وتنفيذ التدابير الرامية إلى منع الفساد ومكافحته وتعزيز التعاون الدولي. ونحن مقتنعون تماما بما تشكله مواجهة ظاهرة الفساد من أهمية بالغة تحتم علينا العمل جميعا من أجل بناء تعاون دولي يقضي على هذه الظاهرة. ويرحب وفد بلادي أيضا بالدورة الاستثنائية التي عقدها مؤخرا مؤتمر الدول الأطراف في اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة لمكافحة الفساد، ونشكر رئيس مؤتمر الدول الأطراف في الاتفاقية وكذلك مكتب الأمم المتحدة المعني بالمخدرات والجريمة على مساهمتهم في إنجاح أعمالها. السيد الرئيس، في إطار تعزيز الجهود الوطنية لمكافحة الفساد، صادقت ليبيا بموجب القانون رقم 10 لسنة 2005 على اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة لمكافحة الفساد، وأصبحت هذه الاتفاقية جزء أساسي من التزاماتنا التي تم موائمتها مع منظومة التشريعات الوطنية، والتي من بينها قانون مكافحة غسل الأموال لسنة 2005، وتم إنشاء هيئة وطنية تختص من ضمن جملة أمور بمتابعة تنفيذ أحكام الاتفاقية، كما تتضمن التشريعات الليبية عدد من القوانين تعنى بمكافحة الفساد يوكل أمر تنفيذها إلى هيئات رقابية متخصصة، منها الهيئة الوطنية لمكافحة الفساد وهيئة الرقابة الإدارية وديوان المحاسبة ووحدة المعلومات المالية بمصرف ليبيا المركزي، وهي هيئات تصدر تقارير دورية بالخصوص. سيد الرئيس، وبالرغم من الجهود الوطنية المبذولة في مجال مكافحة الفساد، إلا أن حالة الصراع وعدم الاستقرار التي مرت بها ليبيا خلال السنوات الماضية خلقت بيئة ملائمة ساهمت في استفحال ظاهرة الفساد من نهب وتهريب لأموال الشعب الليبي خارج البلاد، ناهيك عن الخسائر التي تتكبدها ليبيا جراء قيام بعض الدول في أراضيها بوضع اليد على بعض الأصول الليبية الثابتة واستثماراتها العقارية، مستغلة الظروف السياسية والاستثنائية التي تمر بها البلاد. سيد الرئيس، وهكذا أصبحت مسألة الأموال المهربة والمنهوبة والأصول الليبية بالخارج من أهم أولويات السلطات الليبية المختلفة، الأمر الذي دفعها إلى إنشاء أجهزة حكومية تعنى بتتبع ودعم استرجاع هذه الأموال، وكان آخرها قرار مجلس الوزراء رقم 1011 لعام 2017 بإنشاء مكتب استرداد وإدارة أموال الدولة الليبية المنهوبة والمهربة. السيد الرئيس، إن الجهود الوطنية مهما عظمت تحتاج إلى تعاون دولي مشترك يسندها وتعاون وتفاعل إيجابي من قبل سلطات الدول التي هربت لها هذه الأموال. ومن هذا المنبر نحث المجتمع الدولي على بذل أكبر جهد ممكن لتنفيذ قرارات الأمم المتحدة المعنية بمكافحة الفساد، بما فيها القرارات التي تحث على تعزيز التعاون الدولي لكبح التدفقات المالية غير المشروعة واستردادها من أجل تعزيز التنمية، والقرارات الخاصة بمنع ومكافحة ممارسات الفساد وتحويل عائدات الفساد وتيسير استرداد الموجودات وإعادتها إلى أصحابها الشرعيين وإلى بلدانها الأصلية. وندعوهم للوقوف مع الشعب الليبي في حربه ضد الفساد واسترجاع أمواله المهربة وإعادتها لكي يتمكن من استثمار هذه الأموال وتوظيفها في البرامج التنموية وإعادة الأعمار. وفي هذا الصدد لا يسعنا إلا أن نتمن المبادرة التي أطلقها الاتحاد الأوروبي في سبتمبر الماضي بالتعاون مع مكتب الأمم المتحدة المعني بالمخدرات والجريمة ومعهد الأمم المتحدة الإقليمي لأبحاث الجريمة والعدالة حول تعزيز القدرات الوطنية لمنع ومكافحة الفساد وغسيل الأموال. ختاماً السيد الرئيس، نؤكد على التزام ليبيا بتنفيذ أحكام اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة لمكافحة الفساد وكافة الصكوك الدولية التي تعد طرفاً فيها، وترحب بأي تعاون دولي مشترك بالخصوص، وتعرب عن استعدادها التام للتعاون مع الجميع في سبيل التخلص من هذا السرطان الذي يهدد ويفشل مشاريع وأهداف الأمم المتحدة في تحقيق التنمية المستدامة التي نسعى جميعاً لتحقيقها. وشكراً سيد الرئيس.
I thank the distinguished representative of Libya. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Andorra.
Señor presidente, muchas gracias. Agradecemos al presidente de la Asamblea General la celebración de esta sesión especial y la oportunidad que se nos brinda de participar y de exponer la preocupación que compartimos todos ante la corrupción. Es de manera conjunta que podemos reforzar las responsabilidades que debemos tomar para hacerle frente. Agradecemos asimismo a la Oficina de las Naciones Unidas contra la Droga y el Delito los instrumentos que pone a disposición de los Estados. El impacto negativo de la corrupción, que ha sido evocado a lo largo de esta reunión con evaluaciones de las cifras de pérdidas causadas por prácticas corruptas, es uno de los obstáculos de mayor envergadura para lograr los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible, para respetar sus principios y establecer sociedades más justas y más solidarias. El ODS 16, que vela por sociedades en paz, por la justicia y por instituciones sólidas, es explícito en este ámbito. En un momento crítico para la recuperación de las crisis derivadas de la pandemia de la COVID-19 en tantos sectores, es crucial hacer frente común contra la corrupción, puesto que es una amenaza para la estabilidad y la seguridad y erosiona la confianza en las instituciones. Restablecer la confianza es el paso necesario para el entendimiento, para la democracia y para la gobernanza. Favorecer las condiciones para prevenir la corrupción y para evitar la impunidad es indispensable para devolver dicha confianza en las instituciones, en la política y en la comunidad. En los servicios públicos, en la administración, en las instituciones, la transparencia es una de las claves para su credibilidad y para contribuir a la eficacia de sus objetivos. En Andorra, la prevención de la corrupción ha llevado a dotarse de una estructura normativa e institucional que permita acciones en el ámbito nacional y en la cooperación internacional. En esta esfera, la internacional forma parte del Convenio para combatir la delincuencia organizada transnacional de las Naciones Unidas. Es miembro activo del Consejo de Europa y forma parte del Grupo de los Estados contra la Corrupción, el GRECO, y del Convenio Penal contra la Corrupción. Siguiendo las recomendaciones internacionales, nuestras instituciones han desarrollado los instrumentos necesarios para la prevención y la lucha contra la corrupción. Junto con las responsabilidades que cada Estado debe asumir, el trabajo conjunto y el multilateralismo se manifiestan nuevamente como espacios imprescindibles para el combate contra la corrupción y contra la impunidad, así como para la consolidación de los avances para sociedades más justas, coherentes con la hoja de ruta de los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible. Con actitudes de tolerancia cero ante la corrupción, podemos velar para que el Horizonte 2030 sea una de las metas de los ODS en las que sean una realidad y conseguir con ello el fin de prácticas criminales como el tráfico de seres humanos, pero también aquellas que afecten al medio ambiente. Andorra valora muy positivamente las aportaciones de la declaración de esta sesión especial, en la que nos gustaría destacar temas como el uso de las tecnologías y las perspectivas innovadoras para combatir la corrupción. También la educación y la investigación son ámbitos esenciales y fundamentales para la prevención y la lucha. La labor en educación y sensibilización es el que dibuja los valores de una sociedad en la que la corrupción sea inaceptable. Como conclusión, y en la línea de lo expuesto, tengo el honor, señor presidente, de informar sobre el compromiso de mi Gobierno para, a la mayor brevedad posible, llevar a cabo la preparación y las acciones adecuadas para la adhesión del Principado de Andorra al Convenio contra la Corrupción de las Naciones Unidas. Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Andorra. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia.
Monsieur le Président, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, je souhaite tout d'abord remercier le Président de l'Assemblée générale, M. Volkan Bozkır, pour avoir organisé cette 32e session extraordinaire. J'exprime également mes remerciements à tous ceux qui ont contribué à synthétiser les approches eu égard à cette thématique complexe qui représente un défi mondial. J'exprime également notre appui à la déclaration politique issue de cette session. Monsieur le Président, la lutte contre la corruption représente un double défi à la communauté internationale. D'abord, la corruption est un défi mondial qui peut toucher tous les pays, ce qui nécessite une réponse collective et solidaire qui reflète les résolutions onusiennes en la matière et qui fait appel à la coopération internationale. Il s'agit ensuite d'un défi transversal, en ce sens que le fléau de la corruption touche aussi tous les secteurs d'activité d'une manière grave, sapant les efforts visant à réaliser les objectifs du développement durable. Nous soulignons par ailleurs avec préoccupation que la corruption s'est aggravée avec l'apparition de la pandémie du Covid-19, qui ne cesse de fragiliser les économies et les finances en favorisant la floraison des marchés parallèles ainsi que la criminalité organisée. Elle a surtout permis de creuser davantage le hiatus entre les pays riches et les pays pauvres. Dans ce contexte, ma délégation réitère notre appel pour l'annulation de la dette des pays pauvres afin qu'ils puissent mieux se focaliser sur le développement et la réalisation des objectifs de développement durable et de lutter contre la pandémie du Covid-19. Nous estimons que cette mesure est urgente et salvatrice, car la corruption ne peut qu'être vivifiée dans des économies fragilisées. Dans le même esprit, nous soutenons que la communauté internationale devrait accorder plus d'importance aux échanges, des expériences et des bonnes pratiques, ainsi qu'aux initiatives novatrices susceptibles de promouvoir la transparence, l'intégrité et la diffusion d'une culture de responsabilité. Dans la lutte contre la corruption, les États doivent engager l'ensemble des composantes de la société, organisations nationales, entreprises et sociétés civiles pour œuvrer ensemble, notamment en matière de sensibilisation, de prévention et de contrôle. Monsieur le Président, sur le plan national, la lutte contre la corruption est une priorité nationale pour la Tunisie. L'ensemble des institutions unissent leurs efforts pour faire face et prévenir la corruption. Il est évident que l'état de droit et la bonne gouvernance demeurent le pivot principal de cette lutte, et ce, à travers l'application des lois nationales en harmonie avec les normes internationales en la matière. La Constitution tunisienne de 2014 considère la lutte contre la mauvaise gouvernance et la corruption comme une exigence fondamentale pour le bon fonctionnement non seulement de l'État de droit, mais aussi de la société dans son ensemble, en appliquant les normes les plus strictes de transparence et d'intégrité. C'est dans cet esprit que la Tunisie s'est dotée de l'instance nationale de lutte contre la corruption, l'UNLUC, dont la mission consiste à contribuer à la mise en œuvre d'une politique d'orientation générale visant à lutter contre la corruption et à identifier les foyers de corruption dans les secteurs publics et privés. Outre l'adoption des normes juridiques relatives à la protection des lanceurs d'alerte dans le secteur public, la déclaration de patrimoine par les hauts fonctionnaires et la loi sur l'enrichissement illicite, la Tunisie a également intégré une stratégie nationale de bonne gouvernance et de lutte contre la corruption en vue de consolider davantage les efforts nationaux et parfaire l'engagement de toutes les parties dans la lutte contre la corruption. La Tunisie a également créé le Centre d'études, de formation et d'information sur la lutte contre la corruption, dont le rôle consiste également à collecter des informations et les statistiques liées à la corruption et à œuvrer à la diffusion de la conscience sociale au danger de la corruption par des campagnes de sensibilisation dans la pratique et dans la culture tunisienne. Monsieur le Président, pour conclure, nous pensons que la lutte contre la corruption est un défi sans précédent que la communauté internationale est amenée à relever, notamment dans le contexte de la pandémie du Covid-19. Nous devons cependant aller de l'avant dans la réalisation des objectifs de développement durable à l'aube de 2030. En effet, nous assumons une responsabilité collective pour réussir à atteindre les ODD, pour jeter les bases d'un monde plus juste, plus humain et plus solidaire. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Senegal.
Monsieur le Président, je voudrais à l'entame de mon propos me réjouir de la tenue de cette session spéciale de l'Assemblée générale sur la corruption, un phénomène mondial qui entrave le développement économique et social de nos pays. Au moment où la communauté internationale lutte pour se relever des conséquences désastreuses de la pandémie de Covid-19, la corruption continue de coûter aux États, en particulier ceux en développement, des ressources nationales qui, autrement, auraient pu être utilisées pour promouvoir le développement et améliorer le bien-être des populations. Le Programme des Nations Unies pour le développement estime que dans les pays en voie de développement, le montant des faits soustraits de leur destination par la corruption est 10 fois plus élevé que celui de l'aide publique au développement. En outre, la corruption décourage les investissements privés, réduit les ressources disponibles pour les dépenses d'infrastructures, alimente les tensions politiques et sociales, conduit les pays affectés à la dérive et à l'instabilité et fausse les règles du jeu démocratique et de l'économie de marché. Dans les pays corrompus qui possèdent d'abondantes ressources naturelles, la population bénéficie rarement de ces richesses. La corruption détourne des fonds destinés aux services essentiels que sont notamment les soins de santé, l'éducation, l'accès à l'eau potable, l'assainissement et le logement. Il nous semble dès lors primordial de combattre ces fléaux à l'échelle internationale comme à l'échelle nationale avec rigueur et détermination en vue d'atteindre les objectifs de développement durable à l'horizon 2030. Monsieur le Président, la prévention et la lutte contre la corruption exigent une approche globale qui appelle à la coopération internationale. La Convention des Nations Unies contre la corruption constitue à cet égard un outil incontournable qui contient des normes novatrices et mondialement acceptées qui s'appliquent au secteur public comme au secteur privé. Par ailleurs, le combat doit être mené dans un climat de transparence, de responsabilité et de participation de tous les acteurs de la société. Les gouvernements, le secteur privé, les médias, les organisations de la société civile et la population doivent s'associer pour adopter une attitude de tolérance zéro à l'égard de ce phénomène. Au niveau régional, la Convention de l'Union africaine sur la prévention et la lutte contre la corruption encourage les États parties à créer les conditions nécessaires pour promouvoir la transparence et l'obligation de rendre des comptes dans la gestion des affaires publiques. Celles-ci sont d'autant plus importantes pour les pays de la région du Sahel, où la corruption entretient des liens avec d'autres facteurs tels que le trafic d'êtres humains, le trafic de drogue, le trafic de médicaments, le blanchiment de capitaux, le financement du terrorisme et l'exploitation illégale de ressources naturelles. Monsieur le Président, la lutte contre la corruption est l'une des composantes transversales de la gouvernance publique du Sénégal. Elle occupe une place importante au niveau de l'axe 3 gouvernance, institutions, paix et sécurité du plan Sénégal émergent, PSE, qui constitue le cadre de référence de la politique économique et sociale du gouvernement à l'horizon 2035. Cet engagement a été traduit de façon concrète par la ratification et la transposition des instruments internationaux en la matière dans le droit positif sénégalais d'une part et en renforçant le dispositif institutionnel de lutte contre la fraude et la corruption d'autre part. Ainsi, en plus des corps et organes de contrôle interne de l'État incarnés par l'Inspection générale d'État, IGE, et l'Inspection générale des finances, IGF, une structure dédiée nommée Office national de lutte contre la fraude et la corruption, OFNAC, a été mise en place. Dans le même sillage, une autorité de régulation des marchés publics a été également créée car la conclusion de contrats constitue un moment favorable à la corruption, au favoritisme et aux ententes illicites. Ces pratiques conduisent à la mauvaise affectation des ressources, à l'aggravation de la pauvreté chronique et à l'accentuation de la distance entre les citoyens et l'État. Tout ce dispositif est destiné à réduire ce phénomène et à créer un environnement plus favorable à une utilisation efficace des ressources nationales et des investissements locaux et étrangers. Au niveau de la sous-région, le Sénégal joue un rôle important dans la coopération entre États et abrite le siège d'une des plus grandes plateformes africaines anticorruption. Il s'agit du réseau des institutions nationales de lutte contre la corruption en Afrique de l'Ouest, qui est un vecteur stratégique de la coopération régionale et qui vise, entre autres, à harmoniser les dispositions juridiques, réglementaires et administratives entre États membres, à échanger des expériences et des outils standardisés, techniques et des approches dans la lutte contre la corruption dans les États membres de la CEDEAO et à faciliter l'application des dispositions de la Convention des Nations Unies contre la corruption. Je vous remercie.
I thank the distinguished representative of Senegal. I now give the floor to the distinguished observer of the Observer State of the Holy See to introduce a statement by the Secretary for Relations with the States of the Holy See.
Mr. President, I have the honor to introduce the pre-recorded video message of His Excellency Archbishop Gallagher, Secretary for Relations with States of the Holy See.
Mr. President, the Holy See welcomes this special session of the General Assembly focused on examining the challenges to prevent and combat corruption and the measures necessary to strengthen international cooperation against this crime. The Holy See welcomes in particular the adoption of the political declaration, our common commitment to effectively addressing challenges and implementing measures to prevent and combat corruption and strengthen international cooperation at the opening of this special session. Corruption is limited by neither politics nor geography, and it exists in both rich and poor countries. By betraying moral principles and the norms of social justice, it hampers the attainment of integral development and the eradication of poverty. By undermining trust in public institutions and between the governing and the governed, it compromises the good functioning of a well-organized society. If we are to provide access to justice for all and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels, as we pledged to do in the Sustainable Development Goal 16, corruption must be confronted and eradicated. Due to its pervasive nature and manifold consequences, the prevention of corruption requires more than legal mechanisms. We need to promote a broader culture of integrity. Public servants in particular must embrace justice, sound financial management, good governance, and social responsibility. It is also crucial to enshrine the virtue of justice in human society and to fortify the common good through the observance of the rule of law. In fact, the rule of law and crime prevention must go hand in hand. The prevention of corruption is closely related with the respect for and protection of universal human rights at both the national and international levels. As Pope Francis noted, true justice is not satisfied by simply punishing criminals. It is essential to go further and do everything possible to reform, improve, and educate the person. As rightfully noted in the political declaration, it is necessary to further enhance international cooperation to combat illicit financial flows, which are both an enabler and a consequence of criminal activity, as well as to expand existing international mechanisms for asset recovery and criminal prosecution of corruption cases. Both are essential to combat impunity and to deprive criminals and criminal organizations of any illicit gains through identifying, tracing, seizing, confiscating, recovering, and returning proceeds of crime. The Holy See acceded to the UN Convention Against Corruption in 2016, intending to contribute and to give its moral support to the global prevention, repression, and prosecution of such crime. Because instruments of criminal and judicial cooperation constitute effective safeguards in the face of criminal activities that jeopardize human dignity and peace. In line with the provisions of the UNGASS, Pope Francis has recently enacted various legal provisions and administrative measures aimed at fostering transparency, control, and competition in the procedures for the awarding of public contracts, enhancing financial disclosure of potential conflicts of interest by Holy See and Vatican City state public officials. Mr. President, the special session of the General Assembly offers a unique opportunity to advance the efforts of all states parties to share best practices and lessons learned in the fight against corruption. The Holy See wishes to highlight in this regard the important contribution made by civil society organizations, corporations, faith-based organizations, and research institutions in supporting states' efforts to contrast corruption. Thank you.
I wish to thank the Secretary for Relations with States of the Holy See for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the International Development Law Organization to introduce the statement by the Director General.
Mr. President, it is my honor to introduce a pre-recorded statement by Ms. Jan Beagle, Director General of the International Development Law Organization. Thank you.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, it is a pleasure to address this special session of the General Assembly on reinforcing our common commitment to prevent and combat corruption. As the only global intergovernmental organization exclusively dedicated to promoting peace and sustainable development through the rule of law, IDLO endorses this Assembly's urgent call to tackle corruption. The political declaration recognizes that corruption is a threat to the stability and security of societies, undermining the institutions and values of democracy, our ethical values and justice, and jeopardizing sustainable development and the rule of law. COVID-19 has magnified the scope of this challenge, which has not just hampered global efforts to respond and recover from the pandemic, but has also further eroded already low levels of public trust in governments. The world is experiencing a crisis of confidence in public institutions at a time we need them most. Since the pandemic began, IDLO has worked with partners around the world to address emerging justice needs, including strengthening measures to combat corruption. In countries including Armenia, the Bahamas, Kenya, Kyrgyzstan, the Philippines, Somalia, and Ukraine, we are helping to make justice institutions more transparent and responsive, and enhancing their capacity to prevent, detect, and prosecute fraud and economic crime. IDLO is also supporting the work of the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group, chaired by Italy. Allow me to share 3 points drawing on this experience. First, the pandemic provides us with an opportunity to rebuild open, transparent, and accountable institutions that deliver for people. This means transitioning to people-centered models of governance, including approaches to anti-corruption. It is in this vein that I would like to applaud the inclusion of specific references to gender equality, the importance of advancing women's empowerment, and the commitment to improve understanding of the gender dimension of this problem. Digital innovation, including emerging technologies, digital tools, open data, and digital government approaches, can play a key role in increasing cost-effectiveness and efficiency while reducing risks of corruption. I'm glad to see this reflected in the political declaration, but we must ensure that the implementation of these approaches is equitable and inclusive and does not create new forms of discrimination. My second point is that ensuring judicial independence and integrity must be a priority. The judiciary has a critical role to play in the fight against corruption, and I am glad to see the political declaration reiterates the importance of safeguarding its independence. We must strengthen the ability of justice officials to prevent, investigate, prosecute, and adjudicate offences related to corruption. In IDLO's experience, specialized anti-corruption judicial bodies are also an effective way to provide timely resolution of corruption cases while avoiding delays and backlogs. Third, and most importantly, we must work together to put the principles in the declaration into practice. Rebuilding people's confidence in government was highlighted as a major challenge by global leaders in the United Nations 75th Anniversary Declaration last year. And as the recent SDG 16 conference, organized by IDLO together with Italy and UNGASS underlined, the rule of law is critical to addressing the root causes of this lack of trust. It can enable governments to act quickly and decisively through effective laws and institutions. It can support decision makers to balance competing interests fairly and transparently. It can ensure that relief efforts benefit intended recipients and promote a more just and sustainable recovery. And it can protect the least powerful and give them a voice in the debate, helping to build trust. Ensuring continued political and financial support for justice institutions and the rule of law is therefore critical. I would like to close, as the political declaration does, in the spirit of multilateralism. The pandemic has shown us that our most pressing challenges require solidarity and international cooperation, and corruption is no exception. IDLO stands ready to work with our national and international partners to advance effective, sustainable, and innovative solutions to combating corruption, both in this time of crisis and beyond. Thank you.
I wish to thank the Director General of the International Development Law Organization for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished observer of the Inter-Parliamentary Union to introduce a statement by the President.
Thank you, President. It's my honor to introduce a statement by the President of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, Mr. Duarte PACHECO.
President Bosque, my friend, Excellencies, it is a great honor to join you today to share a parliamentary perspective on addressing corruption, an issue that remains critical to restoring faith in government and putting the SDGs back on track. The IPU devoted its joint 2021 parliamentary hearing in cooperation with your office to this issue of corruption in an effort to engage parliaments and parliamentarians more closely in the process for the political declaration that will be adopted at this special session. As a result, I can tell you that the IPU gives full support to this text. It expresses very well many of the issues that we discussed at the hearing, while also highlight in strong colors the role of parliaments in preventing and combating corruption. The declarations reach to underlying governance questions, such as the need to ensure free and fair elections or to safeguard the independence of the justice, is also very welcome. I very much appreciate the pledge in the declaration to support inter-parliamentary dialogue and cooperation, including the IPU, to facilitate the exchange of good practices relating to legislation, oversight and translation of good practices into domestic law. I note that the declaration might have been stronger on the role of women both as victims of corruption and as key actors in the fight against corruption. Consistent with IPU's strong focus on gender equality and women's empowerment, our parliamentary hearing devoted a whole session to understanding the many ways in which women are affected by this issue. This discussion led to a number of recommendations, such as the need for anti-corruption frameworks, to include measures to address sexual abuses and sexual favors as a form of bribery. Over and above the many concrete recommendations to prevent and fight corruption, what is needed in most countries, including in our democracies, is a deeper push for a cultural shift against corruption, as well as stronger political will. In too many places, corruption is still treated as something inevitable fact of life, when it is in fact a violation of rights, a breach of the public trust, and a waste of taxpayers' money that must be denounced, reported, and prosecuted strongly. As opinion makers and representatives of the people, parliamentarians need to be models of honesty, transparency, and accountability. They need to lead a society-wide effort to shift attitudes about corruption. This is why nothing offends me more as president of the IPU than the case of political leaders who are themselves at the receiving end of bribes in return for political favors. I give my complete support to this declaration recommendations to criminalize more strong trading in influence, abuse of functions, and illicit enrichment that involve public officials, be they elected or appointed. In this regard, stronger measures are needed to prosecute cases of grand corruption involving political leaders who steal from the public life without impunity. While our hearing found no consensus on the establishment of a criminal court to investigate such cases, it is clear that much more can be done. As we enter a new phase of implementation of the 2005 Convention Against Corruption, the IPU will continue to highlight this issue as a part of its core mission of democracy building. Democracy is far from being a sufficient condition to prevent corruption, but is essential and necessary one. Thank you for your attention.
I wish to thank the President of the Inter-Parliamentary Union for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished observer of the International Criminal Police Organization to introduce a statement by the Secretary General.
الرئيس، يسعدني أقدم لكم كلمة مسجلة لمعالي الأمين العام لمنظمة الشرطة الجنائية الدولية الانتربول.
Excellencies, it is an honor to participate in this United Nations General Assembly special session dedicated to the global fight against corruption. A once-in-a-century pandemic has led to unprecedented crises in our communities, on our economies, and yes, on our security. COVID-19 has offered fertile opportunities for criminals to prey on public emergency funds and stimulus packages, endangering the health and safety of our citizens. With over 1,600 active law enforcement alerts related to corruption shared among 194 Interpol member countries, we are witnessing firsthand how corruption does not conform to confinement. Quite the contrary. In 2020, Interpol requests for cooperation in corruption cases saw a surge in nearly 30% compared to the previous year. And so far, 2021 is confirming that upward trend. On the other hand, we see transnational corruption is evolving. It is adapting at breakneck speed. On the other hand, law enforcement and specialized agencies at the front lines are counting on a trusted, neutral, robust, and readily available network to seamlessly exchange information across the world. Indeed, the pandemic also reminded us we cannot effectively fight global threats alone. This has been a precious lesson global law enforcement has put in practice for the last century. Interpol has partnered with the World Bank and UNODC's Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, creating a dedicated global focal points platform that has expanded unabated to this day. In the last decade, nearly 250 anti-corruption and asset recovery practitioners from 137 countries have joined the global focal point network on asset recovery. As a result, both judicial and law enforcement authorities work round the clock and around the globe via Interpol channels, assisting efforts to locate stolen assets and responding to emergency requests for assistance. A new state-of-the-art collaborative platform was recently introduced for authorized users to exchange anti-corruption intelligence in a secure manner. At its foundation, the same robust communication network recognized by Article 46 of the UN Convention Against Corruption, the same network relied upon by 194 member countries to identify high-value targets involved in international grand corruption cases. Today's special session comes at a key moment when our economies seek to emerge stronger from a global crisis and transition into recovery. UN General Assembly Resolution 7510 recognizes Interpol's global policing goals and their contribution to the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. We see our efforts in the fight against corruption as part and parcel of our commitment for a safer world. This is why Interpol commends the Conference of the State Parties to the UN Convention Against Corruption for achieving today's forward-looking, action-oriented political declaration. We hear this call for all relevant stakeholders to come together and action a clear blueprint for international collaboration and coordination. In particular, Interpol concurs that a reliable, high-quality, timely and effective system is critical to reduce delays in communicating mutual legal assistance requests via official channels. As a matter of fact, such a system is already within our reach through Interpol's century-strong infrastructure. Interpol's General Assembly had exactly this in mind when it endorsed the establishment of an electronic system to securely transmit requests for mutual legal assistance in real time. Interpol's EMLA initiative is a turnkey, ready-to-use concept with a tailored legal framework already recognized today by 194 countries worldwide. This would be built upon the century-old law enforcement community, the politically neutral framework, and the reliable technical infrastructure already used daily via Interpol channels. With the support of the international community, EMLA can serve member states in fulfilling commitments under today's declaration and the goals enshrined in the UN Convention Against Corruption. In closing, I wish to reaffirm Interpol's commitment to support all stakeholders in the fight against the scourge of corruption. Thank you.
I wish to thank the Secretary General of the International Criminal Police Organization for the statement just made. I now give the floor to Mr. Thomas STELZER, Dean and Executive Secretary of the International Anti-Corruption Academy.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to address this special session of the United Nations General Assembly Against Corruption, representing the International Anti-Corruption Academy. I believe this special session of the General Assembly could mark a turning point in the global fight against corruption. It is the culmination of a long process which has brought corruption into sharp focus for the United Nations and the international community. The international community now recognizes the extent of the challenge of tackling corruption and the great gains that can be made towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by taking it on. Most importantly, we recognize that this challenge can only be overcome together. The International Anti-Corruption Academy, conceptualized to facilitate implementation of the United Nations Anti-Corruption Convention, UNGASS, has been engaged in fighting corruption for a decade this year. In that time, we have developed the expertise and experience needed to fulfill our unique mandate of providing anti-corruption education and technical assistance based on solid research to those who need it most. Over the last year, we have begun to scale up delivery of services and programs to reach the widest audience possible, including by enhancing our e-learning infrastructure. Through our training and capacity building activities, the International Anti-Corruption Academy provides crucial anti-corruption tools, particularly to practitioners from developing countries and least developed countries. In this way, IACA contributes to the development of effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions, as conceptualized in the SDG 16. We stand ready to provide our unique tools and capacities to all UN member states in their efforts to tackle corruption and to achieve the SDGs. While the International Anti-Corruption Academy can have a significant impact on its own, we know that partnership is the key to achieving lasting results. This is why, over the past year, IACA has greatly extended and strengthened its partnerships, particularly with members of the United Nations system. For example, the Academy, together with UNITA, now offers joint master's and joint executive diploma courses on anti-corruption and diplomacy. We also have a new joint project with UNODC on providing specialized training on anti-corruption legislation to least developed countries to fast-track UNGAS implementation. I'm very pleased to see that the political declaration adopted at the beginning of this special session calls for IACA's relationship with UNODC and other UN entities to be strengthened. I believe our unique mandate can complement the work of the United Nations in anti-corruption while avoiding any duplication of efforts. The more closely we work together, the more effective and efficient we can be in achieving our common goals. The political declaration recognizes the importance of education and training in anti-corruption. This is firmly in line with IACA's mandate. One must first see where corruption happens to understand that fighting corruption is in our shared common interest, because we can no longer accept the externalities of corruption, its hidden costs, its hidden economic, social, and political costs. Then we shall be able to combat corruption effectively. Since taking up my post as Dean and Executive Secretary of the International Anti-Corruption Academy a little over a year ago, I have looked forward to this special session of the United Nations General Assembly against corruption as the opportunity to place the challenge of corruption squarely in the sights and the consciousness of the international community. I firmly trust that we will capitalize on the momentum that has been built and that will set in motion the initiatives which can turn the tide in the global fight against corruption. Thank you very much.
I thank the Dean and Executive Secretary of the International Anti-Corruption Academy. I now give the floor to Mr. Robin OGILVY, Permanent Observer and Special Representative to the United Nations of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
Mr. President, Excellencies, 1 year on from the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, its challenges continue to have widespread effects for our economies and our societies. They've also exposed the urgency of fighting corruption. This means preventing corruption during the response to the pandemic, but also as we recover. For more than 25 years now, the fight against corruption has been a top priority for the organization that I represent, the OECD. This work has boosted and complemented the efforts of the United Nations on 4 fronts. First, in fighting transnational bribery and other forms of unfair competition, our Anti-Bribery Convention requires its 44 states parties to enact anti-bribery laws and corporate anti-corruption legislation. And as a result of that, by the end of 2019, 651 individuals and 230 legal entities were criminally sanctioned for foreign bribery offences. This is the first and only international anti-corruption instrument focused on the supply side of the foreign bribery transaction. Second, we contribute to global efforts on the promotion of a culture of integrity and transparency. In particular, the OECD recommendation on public integrity, adopted in 2017, was instrumental in shifting the emphasis from ad hoc processes to really cultivating an evidence and risk-based approach for a public integrity strategy. Third, we're pleased to support good governance in the public and private sectors. The OECD is working to promote integrity and trust in government and business, among others, through our recommendation on public integrity, the OECD principles for transparency and integrity in lobbying, the anti-corruption and integrity guidelines for state-owned enterprises, and our Trust in Business initiative. In parallel, we're redoubling our efforts in the fight against tax evasion, which siphons public funds off at a time when they're most needed. Thanks to those efforts, in 2019 alone, nearly 100 jurisdictions exchanged information automatically on 84 million financial accounts involving total assets of around 12 trillion US dollars. We know that corruption hits the poor the hardest, and this is why the OECD Council adopted a standard on managing the risks of corruption in development cooperation back in 2016, with implementation now well underway and helping to generate lessons and good practices for all development actors. Excellencies, dear colleagues, we welcome continued close collaboration with the United Nations family in these areas, as well as with other international fora, such as the G20, where we're pleased to be working with Italy's presidency on efforts to better measure and respond to corruption, as well as advancing the fight against corruption in sport. So please, Excellencies, count on the OECD's continued partnership as we work towards a resilient and an inclusive recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. I thank you very much.
Permanent observer. I thank the permanent observer and special representative of the UN, of the United Nations, of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. I now give the floor to the distinguished observer of the Council of Europe to introduce a statement by the President of the Group of States Against Corruption.
Mr. Vice President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Hungary currently holds the presidency of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. For this reason, let me underscore the pioneering and decisive role of the Council of Europe in the fight against corruption since the early 1990s. The Council of Europe monitoring body in this area, the Group of States Against Corruption, GRECO, is a global benchmark for anti-corruption efforts. Its multidisciplinary recommendations have steered and advanced the fight against corruption in full respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms. This confirms the relevance of international follow-up in making sure that commitments are met. GRECO's long experience and expertise can prove instrumental in supporting implementation of the UNGASS2021 political declaration. GRECO's own developed monitoring mechanism can serve as a role model and an efficient tool to advance anti-corruption efforts worldwide. It is my honor now to introduce a video statement by His Excellency Mr. Mari Mircea, President of the Group of States Against Corruption of the Council of Europe, on this occasion. Thank you.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to take the floor on behalf of the GRECO, the Council of Europe anti-corruption body. The special session of the General Assembly Against Corruption makes a unique opportunity for all of us to agree and embark together on an ambitious global anti-corruption agenda for the years to come. We should be looking ahead at emerging challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic has taught us how unexpected and severe such challenges can turn to be. We should also capitalize on lessons learned. To this effect, GRECO's monitoring experience over more than 20 years clearly confirms the several tools are essential when we want to curb effectively the scourge of corruption. 4 elements deserve particular mention. First, a multidisciplinary approach where repression and prevention walk together. Second, legislative measures that are implemented. We need action rather than formal steps. Third, sustained political will. And fourth, the mobilization and inclusion of civil society and the private sector. GRECO's multidisciplinary recommendation have steered and advanced the fight against corruption in full respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms. As a result of our recommendations and follow-up, laws, even constitutions, have been changed, practice improved, and institutions set up or reformed. Through this sustained work, GRECO has gradually become a global benchmark for anti-corruption efforts. During this week, GRECO is co-organizing a side event with the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. This will be an opportunity to reflect on good practice and lessons learned to strengthen integrity in the public sector, in particular through transparent, accountable, and inclusive institutions. GRECO's experience, the relevance of international follow-up in making sure that commitments are actually met, peer review mechanisms share an unparalleled position to generate synergies, combine the knowledge and experience, and give momentum to commonly shared concerns. Our effective collaboration has proven crucial to keeping anti-corruption policies high up, not only on the international agenda, but also as a political priority at the national level. GRECO is very much committed to working closely with our partners' peer review mechanisms as to maximize effectiveness. Ladies and gentlemen, the issues that will be addressed in the course of this working week are of the utmost importance. I wish us all every success in fueling political responsibility and engagement towards fighting corruption, and I greatly look forward to the deliberation before us. GRECO stands ready to offer its long-standing experience and expertise to support effective implementation of the political declarations, which will be formally adopted this week. GRECO's own developed monitoring mechanism can serve as a role model and an effective tool to advance anti-corruption efforts worldwide. Thank you very much for your attention.
I wish to thank the President of the Group of States Against Corruption of the Council of Europe for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished observer of the International Chamber of Commerce to introduce a statement by the Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor to introduce a video message from Ms. Maria Fernanda Garza, First Vice Chair and High-Level Champion Against Corruption of the International Chamber of Commerce. Thank you.
Excellencies, thank you for this opportunity to address you today. We commend the UN General Assembly's decision to hold a special session against corruption. I join you today in my role as First Vice Chair of the International Chamber of Commerce and the organization's high-level champion on combating corruption. Our commitment at ICC to fighting corruption is ingrained in our DNA. In 1977, ICC was the first business organization to develop rules against extortion and bribery. Since then, ICC has taken the lead in denouncing corruption, developing tools to promote integrity and ethics in business, while championing effective legal frameworks to eliminate corruption globally. In this context, we are deeply concerned by emerging evidence that COVID-19 has exacerbated instances of corruption, from increases in counterfeiting and piracy to reports of stimulus funds being misused. Recognizing these risks, in July of last year, ICC issued its guidance on integrity for a resilient response and rebuild after COVID-19, which pointed to the crucial importance of maintaining integrity and transparency in procurement during times of crisis, preserving the use of due diligence to address risks of corruption and human rights impacts presented by supply chain disruptions, countering illicit practices in time of crisis, such as counterfeit medicines and medical supplies, addressing corruption risk related to customs, and preserving the rule of law during crisis. Quite clearly, a resilient post-pandemic economy will need to be underpinned by a renewed focus on promoting integrity and good governance. And this will only be possible through enhanced public-private cooperation. That is why it is very timely that the UN General Assembly is holding this special session against corruption now. But this must not be a ceremonial event. A step change in the global fight against corruption is urgently needed. While the entry into force of UNGAS in 2005 was a landmark achievement, in the years since the Convention entered into force, there has been little progress in tackling global corruption based on the UNGAS framework and its review mechanism. Moreover, lessons learned over the past 16 years point to the need to strengthen or add to our legal and institutional frameworks. We believe that strengthening UNGAS enforcement mechanisms could play a major role in combating pervasive corruption, which will be essential if we are to build a resilient and inclusive post-pandemic economy. This would also help level the playing field for the millions of honest businesses throughout our network who should not risk losing commercial opportunities to those willing to pay bribes or kickbacks. That is precisely why we call for a step change in the global fight against corruption. And to this end, we call on UN member states to commit to establishing an open-ended intergovernmental expert working group, including experts from civil society, academia, private sector, and other relevant stakeholders to prepare concrete proposals for additional frameworks and mechanisms to address gaps in UNGAS. Such a group should also consider how the use of new technologies, open data, and artificial intelligence can be deployed in a concerted and integrated manner to speed the global fight against corruption. In closing, only by challenging the status quo and pursuing new, stronger accountability mechanisms, we can really move the needle in making integrity everyone's business. Without that, there can be no prospect of delivering fully of the Sustainable Development Goals. ICC, as the institutional representative of 45 million businesses, stands firmly committed to continue to work with all stakeholders to deliver on this shared goal. Thank you for your consideration. We look forward to your urgent action to help eliminate the scourge of corruption from the global economy.
I wish to thank the Vice Chair of the International Chamber of Commerce for the statement just made. Pursuant to General Assembly Resolution 74/276 and Decision 75/562, I now introduce the pre-recorded statement of Mr. Ahmad bin Abdullah bin Zayed Al Mahmoud, Chair of the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سعادة السيد الرئيس، سعادة السيد الأمين العام، أصحاب السعادة، رؤساء وأعضاء الوفود، زملائي البرلمانيين في كافة أنحاء العالم، الحضور الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. إن أفضل وقت لانعقاد هذه الدورة الطارئة للجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة هو هذا الوقت الذي تتصدى فيه الدول لتعزيز عمليات التعافي وتسريع التطعيم ضد فيروس كوفيد-19، ولكن هناك أشياء يمكن أن تضر بهذه العملية، ومنها إساءة استخدام السلطة من قبل أولئك الذين هم في مراكز القوة وغير الخاضعين للرقابة من خلال استغلالهم للمال العام حيثما كانت مواقعهم. ويجري في الوقت الراهن صرف مبالغ مالية كبيرة كوسيلة للتحفيز المالي من خلال آليات عديدة، بما في ذلك الحوافز الضريبية وتوفير اللقاحات وبرامج الحماية الاجتماعية وحوافز الأعمال التجارية الصغيرة من بين آليات أخرى. وإننا في الوقت الذي نعتقد فيه أن هناك ضرورة ماسة إلى تقديم حوافز الانتعاش الاقتصادي، فإننا أيضا بحاجة إلى ضمان تقديم هذه المعونات المالية ووصولها إلى من هم في أمس الحاجة إليها. إننا ندرك تماما دور البرلمانات والبرلمانيين في ممارسة واجباتهم، وهي أدوار تزداد أهمية في هذا المنعطف الحرج في حياة البشرية، ولا يمكننا أن ندع هذه الأموال الضخمة التي تم رصدها تذهب فقط إلى قلة فاسدة. وبالتالي يتعين على البرلمانات والبرلمانيين ممارسة الرقابة على أعمال هؤلاء إلى أقصى حد لحماية الأموال العامة من سوء التصرف وتعزيز المساءلة للأفراد الفاسدين. وبصورة عامة فإن البرلمان وأعضاؤه هم الأوصياء على المال العام، وهم المسؤولون عن سن التشريعات الجيدة، وهم أصحاب المصلحة الرئيسيين في وضع الميزانيات، وهم القدوة في مجتمعاتهم، كما يتمتع المشرعون كشخصيات سياسية بولاية قوية في منع الفساد ومكافحته من خلال أدوارهم. ونحن كبرلمانيين لا ينبغي أن نكون جزءا من المشكلة، بل يجب أن نكون جزءا من الحل. إن المنظمة العالمية للبرلمانيين ضد الفساد كوباك بوصفها الشبكة الدولية الوحيدة لأعضاء البرلمانات تدعو المجتمع الدولي إلى تعزيز التعاون والشراكة مع البرلمانيين للوفاء بالتزامهم بالمعايير الدولية لمكافحة الفساد. وترحب المنظمة بالإعلان السياسي المرتقب المتفق عليه بوصفه وثيقة تعهد من جميع الدول الأعضاء من أجل العمل معا ومن أجل تعزيز التعاون الدولي في منع الفساد ومكافحته. وفي هذا اليوم فإننا في كوباك نجدد دعوتنا للمجتمع الدولي للتصدي لآفة الفساد والتنفيذ الفاعل لالتزاماته الدولية المتعلقة بالفساد، واتخاذ التدابير اللازمة لتعزيز الشفافية بالإدارة والخضوع للمساءلة من أجل القضاء على هذا التهديد العالمي. شكرا لكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
I thank Mr. Al-Mahmoud for his statement. Pursuant to General Assembly Resolution 74/276 and Decision 75/562, I now introduce the pre-recorded statement of Ms. Sarina Sala, General Director of Foundation para la Democracia International.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. First of all, we would like to thank the NGO unit of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime for the opportunity to take part in this special session on challenges and measures to prevent and combat corruption and strengthen international cooperation. My name is Marina Sala. I am the General Director of Fundación para la Democracia, an Argentinian NGO with consultative status with ECOSOC since 2019. Corruption is definitely the core challenge that underlies most of Latin America and the Caribbean problems. It deepens inequalities, injustice, and it threatens the rule of law. The COVID-19 pandemic we are all immersed in has made everything even worse. Some countries are already seeing progress. Unfortunately, this is not the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, where millions are still waiting to receive the first doses of the vaccine. Corruption undermines the health response to COVID-19, and this costs lives. Moreover, it weakens democracy. a democracy that is already hanging by a thread because so many people have lost faith in politics. Globally, the fight against corruption is failing. We are losing this battle. According to Transparency International, the Americas showcase corruption and the mismanagement of funds in one of the regions most affected by the COVID-19 crisis. A major challenge facing the region is ensuring that funds and programs for COVID-19 relief are not lost to corruption, they say. In our country, last February, the Minister of Health ended up resigning after a series of events known as the VIP vaccination case, where many people close to the current government were inoculated months before other citizens. Furthermore, corruption tarnishes the whole political spectrum, which is a dreadful combination along with fake news. For example, a well-known laboratory had to deny allegations that implied extortion within the negotiation with the Argentinian government for vaccine provision. This contributes to diminishing state credibility and to the misconception of the role that politics should have in society, causing an increasing political apathy, as I mentioned before. Regrettably, corruption also plays a key role against the administration of justice, standing in the way of fair sentences in human rights violation trials. Now more than ever, we must collaborate. International cooperation is essential to overcome this world crisis. Corruption cannot and will not counteract all of our efforts. We must extend our hand to those in need. We must live up to our promise of leaving no one behind. Let inclusion and compassion be more than mere words. Let them be principles to live by. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Salah for her statement. Pursuant to General Assembly Resolution 74/276 and Decision 75/562, I now introduce the pre-recorded statement of Mr. Maurice Nyambe, Executive Director of Transparency International Zambia.
President of the United Nations General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkır, and all delegates to this special session. It is a great honor and privilege to be given this rare opportunity to address the UN General Assembly's special session against corruption on behalf of non-governmental organizations that are not in consultative status with the Economic and Social Council. Your Excellency, corruption has continued to ravage societies across the world, and the need to galvanize global efforts and strengthen our resolve to fight this scourge has never been greater. The urgency of this need has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has, in many cases, accelerated and reinforced the negative effects of corruption, particularly in less developed countries whose health and other systems of social service delivery leave much to be desired. As Transparency International's latest Corruption Perception Index shows, the COVID-19 pandemic and corruption have intertwined in ways that have the potential to spell doom for the global social and economic development agenda. Transparency International Zambia would therefore like to urge governments across the world through this special session against corruption to reflect on the following three factors. 1. As the world recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic, there needs to be a sustained focus on addressing the corruption-related challenges that have characterized different aspects of this recovery, such as material donations that have been made, bilateral support that has been given, and the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccination programs. There is need for governments to put in place mechanisms and interventions that will protect livelihood programs that benefit vulnerable segments of society from falling prey to corruption and to the continued effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Lastly, governments must boost domestic resource mobilization in order to enhance their capacities to respond to the effects of both COVID-19 and corruption. This means, among other things, strengthening legislative and policy frameworks that will allow effective asset recovery from cases of corruption and also make it more difficult for illicit financial flows to occur. Your Excellency, it is our conviction that taking a collaborative approach at global level to address these issues gives us the best shot at making a full recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic while also keeping the momentum going as far as our global anti-corruption crusade goes. we are convinced that a few years down the line, we will all look back to this special session as the pivotal moment that set us on our course to victory in combating corruption. Your Excellency, I thank you.
I thank Mr. Nyambe for his statement. Pursuant to General Assembly Resolution 74/276 and Decision 75/562, I now introduce the pre-recorded statement of Ms. Cynthia Gabriel, founder and executive director of the Center to Combat Corruption and Cronyism.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, it's an overwhelming honor to address this first ever special session against corruption. I am from Malaysia, founding director of the Center to Combat Corruption and Cronyism. I also serve as the vice chair of the UNGASS Coalition. Once a booming economy, Malaysia has been embroiled in the notoriety of multiple corruption schemes, including the 1MDB that stretched over multiple countries and jurisdictions, involved a slew of agents, commercial banks, and international law firms that helped hide billions of stolen cash in offshore jurisdictions, using shell companies to steal money for private and political gain. Whistleblowers, investigative journalists, and anti-corruption activists played a central role in exposing our corruption at the highest levels. And yet, my colleagues and I were repeatedly intimidated, attacked, and arrested by the authorities. We were persecuted simply because we followed the money trail, spoke up, published articles, mobilized the public to demand answers. We overcame the fear, the reprisals, and retribution. We managed to score important victories, though. The former Prime Minister and his cohorts of the 1MDB are now being charged and are on trial. In too many grand corruption cases around the world, powerful individuals and many in the business of facilitating corruption continue to enjoy impunity. The devastating compromise of national institutions by executive power, the corruption involved in financing of political parties, the secret negotiations over asset recovery, gaping holes between domestic jurisdictions, intelligence sharings, and the really pitiable commitments to international cooperation have left perpetrators ample room to run and to hide from criminal action, pointing to a colossal failure in the international framework to tackle impunity and cross-border corruption. We are disappointed, though, that there was no consensus among member states to use this UNGASS to agree on measures that would have resulted in substantive progress in strengthening international cooperation. Nonetheless, we call member states to introduce public registries of beneficial company owners. Corrupt individuals will no longer be able to hide behind secret shell companies, protect whistleblowers, civil society journalists, ensure that oversight bodies and the judiciary are adequately resourced, mandate the publication of declaration of assets, detect conflict of interest, and to take enforcement action to end impunity. We ask you to go beyond the lowest common denominator of your efforts, make this political declaration a success. And we ask you to include us, civil society, as partners in your efforts. We stand ready to support these efforts and to develop solutions to strengthen the international corruption framework. We need to ensure that no more 1MDB happens, not in Malaysia, not anywhere. I thank you for this opportunity.
I thank Ms. Gabriel for her statement. Pursuant to General Assembly Resolution 74/276 and Decision 75/562, I now introduce the pre-recorded statement of Ms. Greta Fenner, Managing Director of the Basel Institute on Governance.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for the opportunity to deliver a short statement on behalf of the Basel Institute on Governance. We welcome the political declaration as a text that provides useful guidance. In particular, we welcome those parts of the text that go beyond previously agreed language, many of which reflect recommendations that our organization has made during the consultation process. Among those, we in particular welcome that paragraph 11 calls upon member states to go beyond the minimum in criminalization with reference to illicit enrichment, and paragraphs that encourage the adoption of regimes for both conviction and non-conviction-based confiscation. We are encouraged that the political declaration does recognize that states do not yet live up to their commitment to afford each other the widest measure of cooperation when investigating corruption and recovering stolen assets. In many countries, international cooperation remains burdened by unnecessary bureaucracy and sometimes procedural law that would appear to be biased in favor of the defense. We are also encouraged that Member States in paragraph 6 have endorsed the notion of collective action as an important emerging norm in corruption prevention. And finally, we are gratified that the declaration refers strongly to the importance of independent law enforcement and the critical role played by non-state actors. The gist of this document gives us reason for hope. But the reality is that on most days, the fight against corruption still feels like a very steep uphill battle. The levels of corruption remain incredibly high, and not a single country is spared. Of course, in parts, this is the consequence of positive developments. The media, civil society, a bolder law enforcement response have helped us to see corruption better and to understand its consequences better. And we should celebrate this as a success, and in particular the many courageous individuals in law enforcement, in the media, ordinary people who resist and stand up, and many of them do so at great personal sacrifice. But corruption is a very resilient and adaptive disease. We're no longer only dealing with the kind of corruption that involved stealing from state coffers. This means purely legal and technical solutions are no longer enough. We must understand the political economy of corruption. We must invest in education so that still more people are able to see through the fog of corruption. Second, corruption has become even more globalized. It is a spider web connecting politicians and businesses regardless of political colour or nationality, aided by nifty middlemen and to still many blind spots on the world map. This stands in stark contrast with the increasing breakdown of global solidarity and governance, misguided references to national sovereignty, and the excuse of bureaucracy. It makes it virtually impossible for law enforcement to stand a chance. The criminals are laughing. We're making it so easy for them. So we must ask more from you, and you must ask more of each other. One, we ask that you truly endorse the strong language encouraging countries to go beyond the mere minimum. Don't be held back because others may not go as far as you want to. Show true leadership, not comparative leadership. And two, please for once be fully accountable. For the fight against corruption to succeed, we need a law, but what we don't need is another political statement that is not followed through. So I call upon you all to allow for full and public scrutiny of what you will do to implement the commitments made today. Those who risk their lives to fight corruption, those who lose their lives because of corruption, every day, in every corner of the world, they deserve this. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Fenner for her statement. Pursuant to General Assembly Resolution 74/276 and Decision 75/562, I now introduce the pre-recorded statement of Mr. Adesola Kazim Adentum, Chief Executive Officer of the First Bank of Nigeria.
Your Excellency, Mr. Volkan Bokre, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Globally, corruption is a plague that impedes economic growth and development. Across several countries, corruption weakens democratic institutions, as well as leads to government instability and erosion of trust. It stifles economic growth, innovation, and sustainable development. Indeed, corruption has also been identified as one of the most prevalent constraints to private sector development. Regardless of size, businesses are confronted with high ethical and business risk and with huge considerable potential damage when corruption is not fought effectively. The urgency to effectively tackle corruption comes at no other better time than now, with the rapid outbreak of COVID-19 and its significant health, social, and economic impact that is being felt globally. As a member of the United Nations Global Compact, First Bank of Nigeria, in line with its corporate responsibility and sustainability approach, incorporates the UNGC 10 principles into its business strategies, policies and procedures, and a culture of integrity. Specifically, the 10th principle of UNGC, which is fighting corruption, states that businesses should work against corruption in all its forms, including extortion and bribery. This means that participants are enjoined to avoid bribery, extortion, and other forms of corruption, but also to proactively develop policies and country programs to address corruption internally and within their supply chains. At First Bank, we are committed to conducting business with the utmost level of integrity and compliance with legal and regulatory standards. Our reputation and success as an organization is built upon this foundation as we strive to maintain our position as a leading organization both nationally and internationally. To demonstrate our commitment to anti-corruption, we have institutionalized measures internally and externally, among which is our anti-bribery and corruption policy, where as a bank, we have adopted a zero-tolerance approach to corruption, and we are committed to upholding related laws and regulations in all our business dealings and relationships. We have also enacted our whistleblowing policy and procedures, where members of staff and other relevant stakeholders are required to report on ethical or illegal conduct or misconduct of any employee or directors and other stakeholders to appropriate authorities in a confidential manner without any fear of harassment, intimidation, or victimization. Externally, First Bank is also committed to report on the work against corruption in the annual communication on progress and in the corporate responsibility and sustainability report. We have been sharing our experiences and best practices through these channels for over 7 years. First Bank has also been partnering with industry peers and other stakeholders to promote anti-corruption programs through the United Nations Global Compact Local Network. Knowing that corruption widens the socio-economic inequalities gap and disproportionately affects the most vulnerable and marginalized people, First Bank, in line with the spirit of collective action, has been actively involved in the steering committee driving the private sector-led initiative against COVID-19 that mobilize people and resources to ensure a formidable response to COVID-19 threat in Nigeria. Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me this platform to address the General Assembly.
I thank Mr. Adedruntan for his statement. We have heard the last speaker in the general debate. May I take it that it is the wish of the General Assembly to conclude its consideration of Agenda Item 7? It is so decided. We have now come to the end of the 32nd special session of the General Assembly. May I invite representatives to stand and observe 1 minute of silent prayer or meditation. Before adjourning, may I kindly request delegates to leave the hall while maintaining physical distancing. I thank you for your cooperation. I declare closed the 32nd special session of the General Assembly. The meeting is adjourned.